Hello friends, and welcome back, or welcome if you are new to my channel. My name is Emily and I make 2 YouTube videos a week, one about books and one about beauty. So today I am sharing with you a big long list of books, and these are the very best books that I was ever required to read in school, K through 12. Next week I'm going to do a college version. But I obviously, like most people, read a ton of books in school, and while I read a ton of books on my own as well, some of the books that I was required to read for class ended up becoming favorites. So this week I wanted to share with you my favorite books that I was ever required to read in school.
Honey?
So I'm sure there are more from elementary school than I'm able to include on this list, but because I was such an avid reader in elementary school, I have a hard time remembering what I read for like a reading group in school and what I read just for fun on my own. I was usually reading like 3 books at one time, so I can't entirely remember. But the first book I want to talk about is Because of Winn-Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. And I remember having to read this book for my reading group in 2nd grade. And this book was such a wonderful story about a girl and a dog, and about making friends over the summer and meeting interesting people of all ages and all backgrounds, and just kind of collecting stories. And it's kind of a coming of age, but in the younger sense. I feel like there's more than one kind of coming of age story. There's the kind that you read in elementary school where the kid is like 10, 12, and you're like, wow, coming of age, right? And then there's like the real coming of age story about a teenager, but this is that like elementary version, and it's a really wonderful story. And I haven't watched the movie in a long time, but I remember enjoying it. And when I was in elementary school, I was extremely critical of book to movie adaptations, so if I thought that one was good, it must be pretty darn good. Next up is some required reading from 5th grade, and when I was in 5th grade, I remember not really enjoying the way we did the books we had to read in class. We would usually listen to the book on tape and kind of follow along. And because I am a pretty fast reader, and as you can probably tell from my YouTube videos, a fast talker in the first place, I always felt like I was reading ahead, but then I would want to go back so I could listen. Super difficult for me. And even now as an adult, when I listen to audiobooks, I have to be doing something else. There's no way I could be paying attention to the audiobook and reading the physical book at the same time. But there was one book that we read that kind of broke that mold for me, and I still loved it even though I didn't like the format that we studied books in, and that was Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim. And this book is about a widowed mouse named Mrs. Frisby and her 4 children, and one of them who's very sick, and she kind of goes on an adventure to help him and help him get better. And on the way, she meets the Rats of Nim, which are an highly intelligent super species of rats, basically. So I don't remember a ton of the details, but I do remember really, really enjoying it. And this was one of those books that stuck with me for a few years after I had finished it. Next up is a book from 7th grade, and that is Nothing But the Truth by Avi. And in this book, it is about a boy who he has gotten bad grades, and he's convinced that his bad grades are just because his teacher doesn't like him. So he decides to kind of come up with a plan to thwart that teacher and, be on the track team like he wanted to be, but couldn't because of his grades. So he decides that instead of standing silently like everybody else for the national anthem in the morning at school, he's going to hum along. And that kind of leads to a whole series of events that gets him in some big trouble. And this book was very different from any book I'd ever read up until this point, and it really made me think about a lot of stuff. And we had a really interesting assignment that went along with this, which was to write an alternate ending. So being able to think about the book in that way and kind of take ownership over my experience of reading it made it really enjoyable. 8th grade, we read a couple of really great books, and one of them is The Giver by Lois Lowry. And if you haven't read The Giver, I don't know what rock you've been living under, but you should definitely read it. This is a great kind of like a dystopian novel before the big craze of them. So we read this when I was in 8th grade. It was the Hunger Games had come out, but the movies hadn't, so it was kind of like people who really like to read had read them and were starting to get into that dystopian sort of genre, but it hadn't hit the mainstream as hard as it was going to in a year or two. So The Giver was it felt super trendy, and I felt like we were really reading a really interesting book. But it is also just a great book. It's a Newbery winner. But in this book, it's one of those worlds where when you turn 12, you get your life assignment of your job. So the main character, Jonas, gets the job of receiver, and there's only like one receiver for each generation. And that means that he is given all of the memories from the previous generations. So everybody's living this beautiful, idyllic life, and they don't really remember a lot about the distant past, except for the Giver, who gives those memories to Jonas. And when Jonas starts to receive those memories, he realizes that maybe life isn't as idyllic as it seems. The other really great book we read in 8th grade was The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, and I remember not learning until a few years later that S.E. Hinton was a teenage girl when she wrote this book, which I feel like makes it even more incredible. But it is about a 14-year-old boy named Ponyboy, and in his life there are really only two types of high schoolers, and there are the greasers like him, who live on kind of the wrong side of the tracks and they dress like t-shirts and jeans, and the socias, who are like the rich preppy kids. And it's kind of, just the battle between the two, normal high school life, until one day Ponyboy's friend kills one of the socias and everything kind of spins out of control. So it was a really great book, super different from anything I had read, and especially different from anything I had read in school. And we watched the movie, which is really awesome, and there's a lot of really famous actors who got their start in that movie. So now we are moving into high school, and one of the books I read in 9th grade was The Odyssey. And if you haven't read The Odyssey, you probably have heard some of the stories from it. Classic Greek mythology about a huge adventure journey, and if you've heard about sirens or Circe or the Cyclops, you've heard about The Odyssey. So I loved reading this book because of all of my other connections to these stories, such as I'm a huge fan of the Percy Jackson series, and so I was able to view the actual book, The Odyssey, through the lens of already knowing about some of these mythical creatures and characters from Percy Jackson. And if you ever watched the show Arthur on PBS growing up, you may not remember, but I hope you do. One of the episodes was super amazing, and it was a retelling of The Odyssey. And I can't even remember why or the context of it or what, but DW was Odysseus, and it's a super great episode. I will try to find it and maybe link it down below. But either way, The Odyssey is really important for a lot of cultural references in many other books and TV shows and movies, so it was really cool to read that original work that things were based on. Next up is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, and I read this book in 10th grade, and this one took me by surprise because the edition we had was this thick, chunky little book that was really big. I was like, there is no way I'm going to be able to pay attention to a school book for as long as it would take to finish this. But I was completely blown away and happily admitted I was wrong, because this book was fantastic, and it was honestly a page turner from the 1800s. I feel like that's rare, but it is about a man who is wrongfully imprisoned, and while he is in prison, he hears a story about some treasure, and he is determined to escape from prison and unearth this treasure and get revenge on the people who wrongfully sent him to prison. So it's a super adventurous, awesome story. I actually kind of want to reread it or maybe find a good audiobook version of it, but this book, honestly, it just surprised me so much how much I loved it. And I think it was one of the first times I had read a book from the 1800s and really liked it. Okay, next up we are getting to 11th grade, my junior year of high school, and that was by far my favorite year of high school in terms of required reading. So we read a lot of really fantastic books, but I'm just going to share 3 of them with you. And if you've watched any of my other book recommendation type videos, you've probably heard about some of these. So first up is The Assault by Harry Mulisch, and we read this as part of our works in translation, and it is about a boy who survived his entire family being killed by Nazis, and this is in the Netherlands when it was occupied by Nazis in the 40s. So he survives this brutal murder of his entire family, and the rest of the story is about kind of how that one event shaped the rest of his life and how those little things trickled down and affected his life as an adult. The next wonderful book we read in my junior year is Persepolis by Marjana Satrapi, and this is a graphic memoir, and graphic memoirs are actually a pretty popular genre and a pretty popular format to tell your own life story, but this was my very first exposure to that. And this book is about her experience growing up in the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And it was especially fascinating. I mean, for the first point, it's just a really good book. The illustrations are great, her story is wonderful, it's really fascinating. But it was especially interesting because the year before, sophomore year, just about everybody in that class had taken comparative politics, and we had learned about the whole history of the government in Iran and how it has changed over the years. So with that much more intense background knowledge than I think a lot of people would have, we were able to really talk about the story both as a work of literature and through the lens of our knowledge of the history of the country. So it's a really fantastic book. It's a pretty fast read because it is a graphic novel, but I would definitely recommend this if you, honestly, to anyone. It's super good. Next is my favorite book of all time, The Book of Embraces by Eduardo Galeano. And this book I have waxed poetic about in many a video, and to many people I know in real life. But it is a book that is told through a series of short vignettes. So somewhere between a short story and a poem, there's a new one on every page, and they're all loosely tied together by the idea of embraces, of communion, of people coming together in the face of adversity. So this book, what made it really special, in addition to I just liked it, it was probably the only book, even out of everything on this list, but definitely out of everything we were required to read in school, that every single person in my class had a deep connection with at least one vignette. So it was a really powerful book to discuss with our class. So my senior year of high school, we read a lot of plays, and that was really interesting to me because I'd read a few plays, a few Shakespeare. We'd read like Julius Caesar, man, that was not for me, but I'd read a few plays, but my senior year we really focused on them. And those mostly did not end up being my favorites, but I did feel like I learned a ton in that class. My teacher, Dr. Foxgood, was incredible, and that class really changed the way I looked at literature and was a big part of why I became an English major in college. But that being said, plays weren't 100% for me. But I absolutely adored The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. And this was a ridiculous comedy of mistaken identity about two women who were in love with the same made-up suitor named Ernest, and the two men who were best friends who were trying to play it off and win the hearts of those women, even though they'd been pretending to be this made-up guy. So it's super witty, really funny, kind of ridiculous, and we were supposed to go on a field trip to see it performed, but it was unfortunately snowed out, and I'm still upset about that because this was a super fun play to read. Alright, and the last book I wanted to talk about was another great book I read my senior year, but I think I was the only person in my whole class who liked it, and that is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And this book, I understand why my classmates didn't really enjoy it. It was definitely kind of weird, and that's because it's told mostly through stream of consciousness, and it's about a woman named Clarissa Dalloway who has always been, she's been this perfect society hostess, she's planning a party, but she kind of spends the whole book is told about just one day in her life, and it also talks about some other characters that she interacts with briefly or encounters on the street, and there's a lot of memories and flashbacks involved, but it is really just her one day, and reflecting on how she doesn't really want to fulfill this role that society expects of her to be this perfect hostess. She's had more complexity in her life, she's had more complicated, more to her, and it's about basically her stream of consciousness reflecting on that as she's planning her perfect party. So reading this is definitely an experience. It's not a light sit down just for fun read. I would definitely recommend taking a highlighter and a pen to it, but if you are interested in like literature, something that like feels like literature, it doesn't feel like reading a book, it feels like thinking, I really loved this book, and it was really fascinating to talk about, even with people who didn't enjoy it. Okay, so those are my favorite books that I was ever assigned to read in school, K through 12. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I would love it if you would leave me a comment down below and tell me any books that you were required to read in school that you really loved, because I would love to check them out. So thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe before you go, and be on the lookout for next week's book video about the same kind of topic, but my favorite books I was required to read in college. So have a wonderful rest of your day.